Yeah. Thank you. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. I need to mute everybody. Got that cute little girl. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Let them know. Yeah. Thank you. You got some kind of like slumber party going on there, Lori? No, it's okay. I'm just kidding around. But you kind of fade out into the black and then come back in. It's okay. I can't hear you. It's all right. We muted you. Okay. So we are in the 5th chapter of the Gita. And we are on text 8 and 9. It's page 240 in my book. Rather than giving an introduction, I think what we're going to do is we're going to just start by reading the verse on its own. And we'll see where it takes us. And maybe we'll introduce the chapter throughout the discussion as the class proceeds. But normally I like to start things off with a recap, so the train's left the station and we're all on it moving forward. This verse is quite favorable to standing on its own. Hey, Devin, good to see you. This verse works real well as a standalone for 2 reasons. Number one is that either you'll read the verse and it makes sense on its own merits, just like sometimes you might read a quote from Plato or Marcus Aurelius, and you're like, wow, that makes sense just on its own, Philotimo, which is Greek for, more or less Greek for integrity. Sometimes you'll read a quote, philotimos is the greatest of all virtues. And you're like, okay, wow, that's a beautiful quote. I think that's Socrates. You guys know what philotimo is? Philo, like philosophy, or like pedophile, that Phil means love. Timo means love of honor. The term means like love for honor, which is used in some contexts to be a bad quality, something that you want to avoid. You want to avoid a love for honor or being overly attached to fame or glorification or flattery. Because if you get overly attached to flattery, then what happens? You become dependent on your flatterers. And then when they have a bad hair day and they criticize you, to the exact extent you got excited and giddy and wrapped up and enmeshed in their flattery, to that same extent, you're going to get bent out of shape when they criticize you in the same shallow way they flattered you. You follow? When you make a sincere apology to somebody, it's important to appreciate them on the front end. Softens the person's heart and lets them know you're coming from a good place. But what you need to do is avoid flattery, because if you flatter people, anybody with depth, when you flatter them, they immediately think, what are you trying to get from me? You know, when people offer you cheap, unwarranted praise and sing your glories above and beyond what you might in any sphere deserve, it should set off a red flag. It doesn't for most people, because most people are so spun out and starved for attention and appreciation that they just, like a pig to a sewer. You guys don't know, pigs eat stool in other countries. Wild pigs live amongst human beings and eat stool out of the open sewers in Southeast Asia. And so, like a pig just like jumping in the sewer and, you know, lapping up a bunch of stool, people just get all giddy about flattery. On the other hand, sometimes people are so shut down when you flatter them, they like have a nervous breakdown. They just can't cope. If you give them any appreciation whatsoever, it like brings up all the lack of appreciation they received in their life, and they just fall apart at the seams. I've seen that happen too. But anyway, for a healthy individual, if you get a bunch of undeserved praise, then you stop and you go, yeah, what are you doing? What are you trying to get from me? I've never been to a bar. I became a monk at the age of 17, and so I never did that thing, and I never looked back. So I never went. So I was never old enough, nor have I had any occasion to, nor any desire to go to a bar. But you could imagine you're sitting at a bar, minding your own business, and some drunk person comes up to you and starts telling you, you're the most beautiful person I've ever seen. You're like amazing, etc., etc. What would be your working premise? I just empathizing with the situation. I know what I would think was going on. What would you guys think was going on? Yeah.
He or she's trying to get something from me, and
I wouldn't think they're trying to get something from me. I wouldn't think that. If I was sitting at a bar and somebody came up and ladled praise on me, just gallons of praise poured over my head out of a big old jug, a honey jug of praise, I would have a real specific idea of what was going on. Maybe I'm jaded, or I've got too active of an imagination. Maybe I'm just, seeing it wrong in my innocence. But I would assume the person was sexually interested in me and they were trying to pick me up. was, what are they coming up to me at a bar for, drunk, and like showering all this praise on my personal beauty on me? Yay or nay? I mean, it seems kind of obvious to me, right? It seems pretty obvious to me. So we all have this sense that when people offer us really unwarranted praise that we don't deserve, that there's something wrong with that. It's not like what I'm saying is an outlandish thing. So if you are a Zen type personality, if you're the kind of person who appreciates the idea of aloofness and detachment from praise and blame and victory and defeat, and you're not up and giddy and then going down to the exact same extent when things are going right in your life and they go bad in your life. If you're not that kind of person, then this verse is going to make immediate sense to you. At the same time, this verse brings up a problem all on its own, even sans context. So on two levels. Number one, this verse by itself without any introduction, although I'm giving an elaborate introduction so you guys will listen carefully to the verse, but without any context within the text that we're studying, because the verse occurs, several hundred verses in to a book, and so it would make sense to do a recap. Like if you jump in on season 4 of a TV series, you got to watch those recaps of season 1, 2, and 3. Of course, why would you even watch season 4 if season 1, 2, and 3 weren't worth watching, and you just want to watch the recap? It wouldn't make any sense. But anyway, but yeah, there's these verses that kind of stand alone. So, philotimo is the greatest of all virtues. Originally, it had a bad connotation. You were a fame chaser, someone who was interested in accolade and flattery, someone who loved praise or honor, loved being honored by others. But eventually, the term evolved, and it became a love of righteousness, a love of honesty, a love of integrity, a love of straightforwardness, a love of selflessness, and it became the all-encompassing Greek virtue, which would have its cleanest corollary in English as integrity. Integrity, of course, being that you live according to your value system, which, you could say, like a Muslim who was engaged in jihad, who had the belief system that jihad was the way to go, could be said to have integrity. Even though you might totally disagree with their belief system, integrity isn't locked into a specific belief system. It rather is whatever that belief system is, you don't have some massive cognitive dissonance. You don't have a massive gap between your lifestyle and your value system. There's the meat paradox, which is that when people find out that animals feel pain, and then you tell them, but your dog feels pain the same way a cow does, why do you eat cows but not your dog? And people have this moment of cognitive dissonance where they realize that their virtue of valuing life, valuing not causing suffering unnecessarily, not causing pain, doesn't match up with their lifestyle. And they have this like little moment where they have to go, and they have to live with the fact that their virtue, their belief system doesn't match up with their lifestyle. It's called the meat paradox. They actually studied this systematically at a collegiate level. When you tell people, would you like to eat a chicken or a pig or a cow, they don't want to eat it. They take the vegetarian option. When you tell them you want to eat beef or pork, then they'll go for that option. If you have pictures of the animal they're going to be eating, they'll pick nuts and fruits and things like that. But if there's no picture, then they eat it. So we don't want to see somebody like, the wet markets of Wuhan. It's like so awful and so horrible, because we're used to having our meat packaged up. I mean, I can't even walk in Like I'll do everything in my power to avoid walking past a butcher shop at a grocery store. I'll like take the long way around. I'll just like, you know, if I have to walk past, I like hold my breath. It makes me want to yak. But that's after we've done everything we can possibly do to separate the animal from slaughter. Go around most of the world and you got these wet markets. They got no refrigeration. And the animals are being slaughtered right in front of you. There's blood and guts all over the floor. And like the meat you get is getting gray within a couple of hours. And the stench of the place is enough to like knock you off your feet. You go around the world, and that's, people don't have refrigeration, but they still want to eat meat. And so you end up with these wet markets where they're slaughtering animals in public and like selling you the meat like as soon as they kill the animal. They kill it and they render it right there on the spot. Because meat's not going to last overnight. By the next day, it's rancid. It's going to kill you. That's why carnivores have this massive, like super powerful stomach acid, 20 times more powerful than ours, because they got to digest that meat really quick, eat through it. And so they got the big old teeth too to rip through it. But anyway. Integrity is that state when your values match up with your lifestyle. And when it doesn't, you got to spend a lot of time and energy burying your head in the sand and not thinking about the things that you're doing that are at odds with your values. That awareness that you're living a life which is at discord with your values sits like a bunch of undigested meat in your head going rancid. And it takes larger and larger amounts of energy to stop that toxicity from resulting in septicemia of your mind. I'm really running with the metaphor, right? But people do this. They spend these gymongous amounts of mental energy trying not to think about the things that they're doing that they shouldn't be doing in their life. Living a life of virtue is actually so much easier. You might have to pass a few open windows without jumping out, but your mind is peaceful. St. Augustine is famous for saying, he's a 2nd century early church father. Before the Bible existed, St. Augustine existed. He came up with a lot of the core teachings of the early church. St. Augustine is famous for saying, "My dear Lord, grant me chastity, but not yet." He wasn't done kind of enjoying his life, He had a big old life in Alexandria, modern day Cairo and Egypt. And so he was living the life of Riley and living a luxurious, Epicurean, indulgent, sensual lifestyle. But he had this idea that he was meant to give it all up. George Carlin said everyone wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. It's the same idea. And so it's actually just a lot easier to bite that bullet a little bit, sublimate a bit, exercise a bit of executive function, learn a little bit of impulse control, and be virtuous. And if you act good, you're going to feel good. World's filled with a bunch of people who don't want to act good, but they want to feel good. They don't realize that's not good. If you're not acting good and you're feeling good, you're on the road to sociopathy. You're on the road to no longer doing the math. Guilt, remorse, regret. These emotions are like food. You can turn it into an eating disorder. But the result, if you have an eating disorder, the solution isn't to not ever eat again for the rest of your life. Like with AA, the job is like never drink again or whatever. You never do it again. But with sex and food, two things they have they have groups for. I guess it's Overeaters Anonymous. I guess they're going to have a bunch of other ones. They have to have Anorexia and a Bulimia Anonymous too. I don't know. They all throw them in the same thing together?
Yeah, they have EDA.
What is it?
Eating Disorder Anonymous and OA.
Yeah. I personally don't think that all eating disorders are the same. I don't think they're best treated the same. I think they have real different makeups. She specializes in eating disorders as a therapist. I think it's like trying to throw people with heroin addictions and people with cocaine addictions in the same group. They have some things in common, but there's a lot of differences in the way they present and the things they struggle with. What do you think?
I completely agree. I've never referred someone to that, and I doubt I will.
Anyway, just a little. With sex and food, I mean, you can be celibate. It's like one of the biggest illusions around is that you need sex to survive. You actually don't. You can be totally healthy and happy and celibate. Most people don't learn the executive function for that. They don't learn the impulse control for that. It doesn't even take that long. A few months of celibacy and the passions really reduce. And as long as you're not inflaming them unnecessarily like an idiot, you get into a pretty cool spot where you can groove, you can ride that wave. Anyway, for sex and for food, when they get into these groups to help people, you can't say, yeah, I have a real problem overeating, so I'm just never going to eat again. It's like, with alcohol, you never drink again. Cocaine, you never do cocaine again. So I'm just like never going to eat again. Or I'm never going to get angry again. They must have an Anger Anonymous too, like Rageaholics Anonymous maybe. I don't know what they call it. They must have a group like that. I'm never going to get angry again. If you never get angry again, there's a problem. Like anger is a natural human emotion. Certain things happen in life where you should feel angry. Just like if you make a mistake, you should feel some remorse. So these emotions, like remorse, they're healthy emotions that happen in people's lives when they don't live up to their values, and they're therapeutic, they're prophylactic, they're healthy. They help you get back on the right track. If you take them too far, they become dysfunctional, and they become part of the problem. But just like with food, you have to learn to have a healthy relationship with food. And with sex, you have to learn to have a healthy relationship with sex. Similarly, with remorse and anger and emotions like this, although they might be dangerous and kind of sharp and a double-edged sword, we should learn to have a healthy relationship with them. And that's the goal. I'm really running the gamut here. Anyway, just to recap all of my digressions and tangents thus far. Sometimes you find a verse, and the verse creates a problem all on its own, sans context. Sometimes you read a verse, and the verse makes sense all on its own, without any additional context. I believe that this verse does both. And so we'll go through it. It's fairly simple to understand. And I think people are going to, they'll end up on one of two sides of this verse. You know, I was talking to somebody not too long ago, and they said to me, oh my God, I just found out, you know how you have that narrative in your mind going on all the time? And I was like, yeah. And they said, I just found out not everybody has that. And I said, yeah, they do. And she said, no, I was just on Instagram, and a really popular influencer posted a statement that some people think with a narration, almost like a voiceover in a movie in their head, and then other people think in terms of feelings and impressions and emotions like that. And he was like surprised that when he found this out, when he learned this from some psychologist, And so he posted about it, and then thousands of people commented, and some of them said they thought and had a narration in their head, and other people said they have more of feelings and impressions, and they think in images. And I said to this person, I said that influencer is foolish, and you're foolish. Because they created a false dichotomy. And so everybody just picked a side. The truth is, everybody sometimes has thoughts in language in their head. We think in language. Children in developmental psychology learn to think along with learning to speak because we think in language. Something very special about human beings. We have this language acquisition device. We have this unique ability to think in terms of recursions and take modules of thought one on top of another and form very, very complex ideas. I'm on a boat, in the water, sailing back home in the morning against the wind. All these different, I can't get jumped on top of animals. There's no evidence animals can think like this. We don't find evidence of this level of language in animals. It's like high-level metacognition that's unique to human beings. Many mammals have metacognition. They think about thinking. They're able to engage in problem-solving behavior, but there's limits. Human beings have this amazing ability to just stack recursion upon recursion upon recursion, and it requires speech to do so. Think about it. We think in words. I lived in Mexico for a while, and I started thinking in Spanish, which sucked for me because my vocabulary in Spanish is way more limited than my vocabulary in English. So I would have, I've come up with like 4, 5, 6 words in my own head to communicate what I was thinking of, because once you start thinking in a language, it's not so easy just to jump back and think in your mother tongue. You think in English, right? Yeah. When you go to Colombia, you start thinking in Spanish, right? It's totally bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah.
And your Spanish isn't as good as your English.
No.
I mean, from linguists, they say can't speak anything, right?
I go there and they think I don't speak Spanish that well, but then here is the other.
Yeah. It's funky though, right?
Yeah. You dream.
You dream in the other language, but the dreams are like a lot less detailed because you have a lot less, at least in my case, I have a lot less access to a vocabulary in Spanish. I can get along. I can do almost anything in Spanish, but I got to use a bunch of words to describe something real simple. I don't know if it's true, but our books are printed in 120 languages. And I was told by the devotees who translated our books into Guinea, the language of Papua New Guinea, that they had no straight word for God as a straight translation. So they had to translate as like big man in sky who makes rain or something like that. They had like a very long sentence to communicate the word God. You follow? So, anyway, there's just another. I find that when people hear a verse like this, it either gels with them and it makes sense, or they're going to have a question. So I'm now introducing a potential dichotomy. You guys can figure it out. If you can walk and chew gum, I'll be impressed. But I'll ask for a show of hands and you guys can tell me what you notice in the verse. Do you notice something you can relate to that makes a lot of sense in its own right? Or is there a glaring deficiency in the verse or like a gaping question that immediately comes to mind? Now, I could be wrong. Like I said, with this person, they introduced an artificial dichotomy, a false dichotomy, because we think in terms of emotions and flavors and colors, and we think in terms of words. And so you might have a little bit more language in your head or a little bit less, but the truth is you have both. You have both impressions and raw emotions that you feel, and you also have language that you think in. And so to artificially separate into one or the other is just that, it's artificial. But when you give people one or two choices, they assume one of the two of them's got to be true. We're taught to think in binary ways so we can take bubble tests or whatever they're called now. What are bubble tests called now? Standardized testing. We're trained to take standardized testing. There's only one answer. But a lot of times in life isn't binary. You got to do some polarity management. You can think about and problem solve in a diverse number of ways, and there's not one and only one way to do things. There's not one best way to do things. I give the example, you have $50 to spend on your kids, you got 5 kids for Christmas. What do? Well, you get $10 to each kid, that's fair. What if one of your kids is dying of cancer? Well, maybe you give them each 10 so they feel normal. Maybe you give 50 to that one kid. Maybe you buy 2 group presents, one for the boys for $25, one for the girls for $25. Maybe one of the kids is going through a hard time in life and it's not terminal. You spend a little extra money on him, a little less on the other people. There's a number of different ways you could do that as a parent in a loving way. And what matters is that you thought it through and that you have a logic behind it. Integrity is having a logic behind your life, having some synergy between your actions and your thoughts. And in that sense, it's a floating virtue because it doesn't depend on some absolute sense of right and wrong. Somebody could have integrity and have a very, Christians have this, 98% of Christians in the world, which is, 3 billion people. There's maybe 100 million people who don't believe this, but 100 million people don't believe this. But for the majority of Christians in the world, it's an exclusivistic system. And so you got to believe in Christ, you're going to hell. And so if you found out that somebody didn't believe in Jesus, and you, burned them at the stake or drowned them so that they would repent and feel bad and maybe not go to hell forever, and they'd suffer a little bit so they didn't have to suffer a lot. Is there a logic to that? There is. It's formed on a really, I think, impoverished notion of divinity and an exclusivist notion of divinity. But there is a logic to it. That person could be said to have integrity, which is like a really bad value system. So, to wrap it all up one more time. I think this verse is going to make you guys go one of two directions. We'll read it in just a second. The verse is a standalone verse, like many great sayings you get from thinkers throughout the years. And I gave the idea of philotema. And then how people kind of immediately, if you're familiar with Greek and you're familiar with Greek thought, you understand philotema is like this incredible value. What's its name? When Obama went to Greece, he spoke on philotema. And the people just applauded. He goes, the greatest of all virtues, philotema. And everybody just burst into applause. They were just yes. We immediately love you because you figured out exactly what our thing is, our raison d'etre, the very essence of our peoples. And so it was, integrity. And so this verse presents an idea. And I think the idea stands on its own. And so without further ado, a person in the divine consciousness, although engaged in seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, eating, moving about, sleeping, and breathing, always knows within himself or herself that they actually do nothing at all. Because while speaking, evacuating, receiving, or opening and closing the eyes, He always knows that only the material senses are engaged with their objects and that he is aloof from them. Now, the book was written before 1980. The book was written before the late 70s when gender-neutral language came into vogue. So you can't fault the author for speaking in the masculine for the unknown, because that's even what feminist literature did up until about 1976, 78. So we can just avoid worrying too much about that. Because like I said, even feminist literature up until about 1980 didn't use gender-neutral language, what to speak of the rest of the world. All right, let's look at the Sanskrit for the verse. Naiva kinchit karomi iti. You see the Roman letters that don't look like English? That's called a Roman transliteration. It allows you to read the Sanskrit if you don't read Nagari, which is the language that the Sanskrit can be written in many languages. The standard language these days is Nagari. And so, Naiva kinchit karomiti means yukta manyate, tattvavit. Tattvavit, the knower of truth. Tattva means thatness. Something which is truth has the quality of thatness. So in Sanskrit, tat means that, om tat sat. And so tattva, tva means ness. It's a suffix, so thatness. Something which has the quality of existence, of thatness, that it exists, is truth. Tattva in Sanskrit means truth. Tattva vit, one who knows the truth. Vit is where you get the word Veda from, which is books of knowledge. It's also where you get the word video from. It also, I believe, is where the word idea comes from. So, vit means, vid means knowledge. Here it becomes vit. The D becomes a T through sound changes. And so, vid means to know in Sanskrit. And it's cognate to a number of different words in English. Among them, video, which allows you to see something and then know it. And here it's tattvavit, you know the truth. And if you know the truth, manyeta. If you know the truth, they think, he thinks, it's in the first person singular, present tense, he thinks, naiva kimchit karom iti. Iti means quotation marks. It means many things in Sanskrit, but depending on the way the sentence is written, it means quotation marks. So in Sanskrit, if you want to say he thinks, and then you say the thought he thinks, which, by the way, remember how I went on this big, massive tangent, how we think in language, and it seemed like I was just going off the deep end on one digression after another? I wasn't. I knew where I was headed. And so in Sanskrit, just like in English, thousands of years ago, they talked about people, manyeta means he thinks. He thinks, what does he think? Iti, quotation marks, naiva kinchit karomi, I do nothing. The knower of truth thinks I do nothing. You follow? The knower of truth thinks I do nothing. Pashyan, when seeing. Shrinvan, hearing. Sprishan, touching. Jigran, smelling. Ashinan, eating. Gachan, going somewhere. Swapan, dreaming. Swashan, breathing. Pralapan, speaking. Vishrinjan, evacuating, meaning, it means, the word vishrinjan literally means like throwing out. But in this instance, it means evacuating, because in old Indian philosophy, in what's called Sankhya philosophy, the kind of beginning spiritual leanings of the old Veda, there were 10 senses. 5 of them were ways you take in information. Taste, sight, touch, smell, and sound. What we think of as the 5 senses. And you take information in through gates. Literally through holes in your body that allow information, the pores of your skin, that allow information to enter into your consciousness. It's a wild and brilliant way of looking at the world. And sometimes you hear these old ideas and you're like, whoa, they nailed it. They talked about the body of 9 gates, Navadwar. Actually, it'll be talked about in 3 verses if we get there today. And so there's a city of 9 gates. The body is a city and it has 9 gates. 2, 4, 5, 7. Where's 8 and 9? 8 and 9. 9 gates. 9 holes in your body. Now, 5 of your senses are called Gyanendriyas. They pull information in. And 5 of them are Karmendriyas. They act on the world. They do karma. The word karma in Sanskrit means action, not reaction. Reaction is not what's meant by karma. Reaction is the result of action, and therefore karma pal, the fruit of karma, is the result of acting, which is karma. When the word was loaned into English, it got adjusted a little bit. And it came to mean reaction, which is intimately linked to action. These are karmendriyas, the way you act on the world. How do you act on the world? You move. You manipulate things. This one is 2. You eat and you speak. So when you speak, you act on the world. You evacuate and you regenerate. That's the genital and the rectum, the tongue, and in our case, hands and feet. With other animals, they may move and mess around with things through other versions of appendages. But these are the basic features of a living entity, that they have multiple ways they take in information and multiple ways they act on the world. Wow, isn't it? It's really far out, isn't it? And human beings have an incredibly evolved sense of speech. Just like tigers have incredible, powerful stomach acid, huge teeth, massive fast twitch muscles. They can just like leap out of nowhere. Monkeys are like that. If you're hanging out and you've got like a banana and there's a monkey sitting where you are and he's eyeing your banana and you're like, you ain't gonna get my banana. He can jump from where he is, grab your banana and jump back there before you can react. It's unbelievable how fast they are. It's freaky. Like you see them coming at you, but before you can mount your defense, they're already gone. It's like magic. They're fast twitch muscles. Like the gnarliest sprinter you've ever seen. Right? Did we have some experience with monkeys? I mean, I've had so many experiences with monkeys. But whenever we go, right? They're gnarly. They'll mess around. My daughter still, my 3-year-old still talks about monkeys every day of her life. She's 3. She's not supposed to remember anything. She's like, Dad, hide that so the monkeys don't get it. I'm like, you're 3. What are you talking about? She's like scarred because Anandini failed her. She's like, don't you remember, Dad? Anandini was with me and the monkeys got us. You remember? Anyway, you look at like eagles, falcons. Some falcons are bigger than eagles. Have you ever seen like a full-size falcon? It's unbelievable. I have like a 10, 11-foot wingspan. They're freaky. They're so big. But they've got these incredible eyes, and they can see. What can we do? We can communicate. That's what we're put on this earth to do. To think, to speak, to teach, to learn. So you have your Gyan Indriyas, ways knowledge is coming in, your Karma Indriyas. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming. I saw you guys kind of doing your thing, and I tried to give you a look and just like, it's cool. We appreciate so much you coming. Thank you so much for sitting with us. We really appreciate it. You have a time limit. Okay, yeah, of course. Thank you so much for stopping by. Thank you very much. Yeah, we were put on this earth to think. So it says Vishrijan, which means to throw away. But because we're going through all the senses, it's clear in this instance it means evacuating. Does that make sense? In another instance, the word Vishrijan may mean something else. But in this context, because it's talking about gachan, walking, and seeing, and hearing, and tasting, and touching, and speaking, so it was talking about the Gyan Indriyas, the knowledge acquiring senses, and the Karma Indriyas, the active senses. Grihnan, grasping. There's your hands. Gachan, moving. Vishrinjan, evacuating. Pralapan, speaking. Unmishan, nimishan api, opening and closing the eyes. So the knower of truth thinks I'm doing nothing, even though he's walking and talking and speaking and hearing and seeing and evacuating and opening and closing his eyes, doing all these things, but he thinks I'm doing nothing. The one who's tattva vit knows the truth. Indriyani indriyarteshu vartanta iti. There's that word iti again. That's your quotation marks. Dhayan. He thinks. He literally holds the idea. He thinks. What does he think? He thinks indriyani indriyarteshu vartanta. The senses are engaged with their objects. The person who knows the truth thinks I'm doing nothing, even though he's seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, eating, walking, dreaming, breathing, speaking, evacuating, grasping, opening and closing his eyes. But that person who's enlightened, who knows the truth, he holds the idea that only the senses are engaged with their objects. And again here, the senses means the knowledge acquiring senses and the acting senses, the way we take information in and the way we act on the world. Okay, what do you guys think of the verse? Yeah.
It makes a very clean distinction between the self and essentially everything else.
All right, that's the good thing. That makes sense. If you thought, yeah, this verse is cool because it shows you that the soul is different from the body, and it makes a real clean distinction that although you're in this world, you're not of this world, then you're in this camp. Anybody think of a big question? Yeah.
Well, according to your introduction, which is something I had never really thought about, but you said that somebody that has integrity.
Take off your mask. I'll still distance from you.
that according to your introduction earlier, you were explaining how integrity is actually where your external activities matches your internal state, your mindset, your virtues. And so at reading this verse, I'm thinking, okay, well, this person is actually disassociating from their actions in this world, so it makes me wonder.
Laura, raise your hand, or just raise your hand if you heard what Varangi said. Great. Did you guys notice that one? That weird tangent I went off on integrity and philotimo and like Socrates and how integrity is a variable emotion and it indicates that you have that whole like long-winded thing I went off on? I wasn't just spazzing out. There was a method to the madness. Everybody thinks that integrity means your actions match your words, and certainly our actions should match our words. Otherwise, we're a hypocrite and we could justify almost anything. So doesn't this verse seem almost antinomian? Antinomian meaning it means you can justify almost any horrendous act because it's not me. I'm not doing anything. It's just my senses doing it. I murdered that poor sod, but it was just my senses engaging with their objects. It wasn't me. How many of you noticed that massive gaping hole in the verse? That huge question? It was like, ugh, what to do with that one? Raise your hand if you noticed that one. I feel like the verse gets taken one of two ways. Either you appreciate it, and it's like, wow, that's a Zen Buddha verse. That's really cool. You're like, what would Jesus do? Like it's like a cool spiritual verse about a transcendental person. Or you're like, wait a second, this doesn't add up. Doesn't that justify almost anything? So Nick did a nice job of articulating Ross did a good job of articulating the good side of the verse, the happy side, the plus side of the verse. How do we deal with this question? Yeah.
It says a person in the divine consciousness, so I'm assuming that...
Actually, it doesn't say that. That's Prabhupada's translation. The verse literally says, one who knows the truth. Prabhupada's translation is really good because if you know the truth, ultimately the truth is divine wisdom and you're in a divine state of mind because that's the ultimate truth of reality in any theistic system is to be in touch with the divine. So it's not like Prabhupada's translation isn't apropos, but as long as we're getting heavy, the verse says one who knows the truth. Yeah?
So I'm assuming if you know the truth that you're spirit and you're the same as everyone and everything else in the world, then you understand that doing harm to those other, souls.
Gotcha. Okay. If this verse only pertains to the spiritualist. If a spiritualist is acting in the world, he's like a lotus flower. That's the next verse, by the way. He's like a lotus flower. He's in the water, but he's dry. He's in the mud, but he's clean, like the lotus flower. But that's not true for like a materialist, like a murderer or a rapist, right? When a murderer or a rapist does something, he's really doing it, right? Huh?
He's creating karma for himself, for his physical body.
Right, but it's not like for that sinful person. Let's just take a rapist. Make it real simple. This verse doesn't pertain to that rapist. When that rapist is committing that sinful act, they're really doing that. It's not just the senses are engaging with their objects, right? You see the problem? If you believe that we're all souls and that these bodies are not us, and that's your philosophy, Is that only true for you when you become self-realized? Or is that true for people irrespective of whether or not they're self-realized? Now, if it's true for those people irrespective of whether or not they're self-realized, then your entire answer fails miserably. Did you see what I just did? Did you see what I just did? Take a minute. You'll realize you got checkmated. You checkmated yourself. I see you guys. You got it now? It took a second, right? Did you guys follow? If the verse is, hey, you are responsible for every single thing you do, it's really you doing that thing, and you really do corrupt yourself and mess yourself up. But when you become a spiritualist, then all of a sudden, like, the fabric of reality changes just for you, and now you're sort of like, riding on the wings of like eagles, to quote the Bible, the Hebrew Torah, the Hebrew Bible. And so then you become transcendental. Otherwise, you're stuck in this world, and you really do the things you do. And this verse doesn't pertain to you. You follow? Now, if your philosophy is that the soul is pure, irrespective of what material state it might find itself in, which is why there's salvation potentially for everybody, without some kind of weird vicarious atonement doctrine, and you can, almost like water, you might become dirty or even filthy, but water can be distilled, and on a molecular level, it never becomes contaminated with the mud or whatever it's mixed with. So you can distill water and bring it back to its original potable state where it becomes drinkable again, which is, by the way, what the sun does with all the water in the world. All the water in the world is constantly being recycled. It's sewage, and it goes out in the ocean, it gets evaporated and carried over the ice pack, and that's like a distillation center. It's a big distillation center in the sky. If you believe that that's the nature of the soul, that's the nature of all souls, irrespective of whether they're sinful or pious. And therefore this verse would pertain to the sinful as much as it would pertain to the pious. And the knower of the truth knows that this is the truth for everybody, not just for himself. Did you guys follow that? Now what's the problem with that understanding? Now you just justified anything, which is the doubt that you were trying to answer, which you failed to answer. All right. We got Nick and M. Well, given it's your birthday, young lady, 9/11, the auspicious day of the year, let's hear the answer.
Just because a person understands they're not their action doesn't mean they don't have any responsibility for it. Like, I can understand I'm not my body, but I still have responsibility for the things that my body does.
Yeah, good. What were you going to say?
I was going to say it's not.
Loud.
Yeah, it's.
By the way, Dave, Darshan, did you hear what Madhuri said? Okay, and then back to you, Nick. Take your thing off and yell at me.
Just for this verse, it's not an ethical claim at all. It's an ontological claim about personal identity and embodiment.
That was even better. This verse does not discuss ethics. It does not discuss what you should do. It delineates really simple actions that people take, which an ethical class would then discuss what should those actions look like. Where should you go? What should you eat? What should you look at? This verse doesn't say what you're looking at. This verse is an ontological verse about the nature of the soul in relation to the body, that ultimately the body is not us and never becomes us. It's not an ethical verse. As long as we're in this body, what should we be doing with it? And so it's a mistake to take an ontological verse and assume it's speaking on ethics. You nailed it. How much time do I have left?
20 seconds.
You said the same thing. You just said the same thing in sophisticated language and academies, in philosophies, and it just rings so cleanly. You make that nice distinction. But it's the same basic point you made. The verse is speaking about the